Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells it all regarding family court and CPS issues. I'm your host, Marianne Petrie, and today I've got a very, very special guest. Her name is Tracy Kittle. She is an adult child of parental alienation and is an executive board member of the Hero Circle. Tracy's dream is to one day see all 50 states adopt a rebuttable presumption of 50-50 custody to end the unnecessary separation from either parent and put a stop to covert alienation. She is the co-host of Friends Talking Nerdy podcast. Also, she's working on a book called Parental Alienation, The Aftermath. So it's a collection of true stories told by adult children of parental alienation. And this is part of her campaign to bring public awareness to the serious form of child abuse. And we're going to talk a lot about this, and I'm so glad to have you on. And how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing pretty well, and as far as pandemic times go, I guess at least we can use the internet and all the connectivity to still talk and meet new people. I'm very happy to get to meet you today, for example.
So thank you so much. And how did you get involved in your hero circle?
It's had a long journey. I actually originally, and I've bounced around a little bit, like I've moved. I'm a very nomadic person, but
Mhm.
originally I started getting involved back in Arizona when I first was introduced to things like the Father's Rights movement, and that's when I kind of started becoming aware that
Mhm.
maybe there was something in my past that I hadn't quite realized yet, as far as, a lot of the separation and the really roughness of the relationship with my father.
Mhm.
Um, and that's my personal story that I know I've gone on about in interviews on the Victim to Hero and the Hero Circle.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's where I first kind of learned that there was activism around this idea that somebody was having their children taken from them, kind of by how the courts have things set up. So then later on in life, I grew older and I kind of started to really get this feeling that, in my situation, it was my father, and that there seemed to be a lot of stuff against him. And so I had really started to spin up to get involved, for the father's rights portion of it. But I ultimately, wound up not doing that. There was something about it that didn't seem to completely mesh with my actual problem with parental alienation, or the idea of any parent having their child just taken from them in that way, is that what it's actually doing to the children. And that's been a big part of my healing journey, my mental wellness discovery journey, and kind of picking apart, going back and realizing how much this affected my life. And then you get out there and you realize there are more people. There are more people who were kind of this test batch of kids that had these divorces that kind of went a certain way. Like, you were always with one parent primarily. Like, the concept of a 50-50 split was, I had never heard of it when I was a kid, going through divorce and everything. So, I guess that's what really kind of got me into it. Was it went from one thing to another. I realized something bad had happened, but the father's angle wasn't the fight that I wanted to do for me personally. And they're great people, by the way. I can't emphasize enough that I would have loved to work with them. But there was just something in my heart that kept telling me that there's another angle to this that really needs a voice. And I very strongly feel like it is us adults who can now speak about our experiences from our perspective.
That's excellent. What do you think about? I know you want to see at some point the 50 states adopt a rebuttable presumption of 50-50 custody.
Yes.
And when did you come across that and learning about that whole thing?
Well, that was definitely through, because I started to spin up to volunteer on an official capacity. And that was when it was like, hey, there's this term, and what is it? And there was something about the idea of taking it out of family courts that I really loved about this idea. It's like if somebody wants to kind of be, resentful and try to, use the kids as kind of this piece of property almost that you fight over, there's no payout for it, because the whole idea of the rebuttable presumption of 50-50 is the two adults in the situation, the two parents, which, even the judges will tell you, or at least what I have heard in many cases is that, their little PSA on it is, I'm not going to be able to pick as well for the kid as you guys can as the parents. And so what's nice about these states that are moving towards that is if one parent wants to try to hold that relationship with those children hostage, the best they're going to get is half the time.
Mm.
So that way, if there is a situation where it's like, hey, if the mom is like a full-time doctor, or, is the one that doesn't have the schedule necessarily where it's like, hey, sure, I could have them 50-50, but they're going to be at home with a babysitter most evenings. It
Mhm.
allows for that kind of negotiation too, for people who are getting along.
Mhm.
So it kind of helps put a little bit of a stop on some of the pettiness that can happen. Like even when in mediation, mediators do try their best, and they're brilliant people. It's honestly a career I've even entertained as I tried to figure out, like, how do we fix this problem, right? But I think there really is something to kind of setting that standard. And another reason that I really feel strongly is not only just to negate some of the arguing and taking it out of a palace that is built around winning and losing that is our court system, right? So that's
Mhm.
automatically got you, when you're in a win-lose situation, you want to win. And then a lot of times winning is winning the things, winning, alimony, winning the kids.
Mhm.
And that's where I feel like we get into this slippery slope of we're making them property. I felt like property. Like I
Mhm.
could say that is my truth. I overheard conversations where I kind of felt like I was a little bit of that property piece.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that's I guess how I heard about it and why I support the idea.
Mhm.
Because if we do normalize a 50-50 split, I honestly feel like it's going to make it stand out a little bit more when you have somebody fighting against a parent being around their child. Because why would a good parent fight against a good relationship with the other parent?
Right, and that's a good point. The child support is like a kids for cash, is what they're using it for. What do you think? Now, this is like kind of two questions in one. Like, what would happen if we just abolished family court and got rid of Title 4D?
Ooh, you might have to inform me on what Title 4D is.
Oh, I'm sorry. That is child.
That's
That
okay.
is the child support. Sorry, I'm
Thank
so
you.
sorry.
No, it's okay. We are a new organization and there's a lot of fighting to happen. And so I'm still very much learning. So I appreciate always being informed of something I
Oh.
didn't know yet. So yes, now abolishing it, I don't know if necessarily completely cutting it out is necessarily, but I'd want to see more studies on that personally. I'm very much, I want to read what people have already figured out and figured out how to quantify in a way, because there is kind of some argument for when there is a big income disparity
Mhm.
between the homes and the quality of life effect that can have on the child. All
Mhm.
right. So, in my understanding of what child support, really the spirit of child support, what it was supposed to be, is a calculation of what that parent would spend on expenses. That includes food, clothing, all of these things, right? Your expenses go up. Your water bill goes up when you watch children, you
Mhm.
know? It's supposed to be a calculation of what they would be spending if they were the one watching their child. And that's where it really blows my mind that any parent would see this as a source of income,
Mhm.
because it's not really supposed to be income. So just sliding in that little, my humble opinion there is this is not supposed to be viewed as income. It's supposed to be something to support raising a child.
Mhm.
But yeah, income disparity can have an effect on the children. I mean, there should be maybe some concession for that. But as far as how it's being applied now, I just don't think it's really the best, because it does kind of give that other, there's the winning of I win because I'm a good parent and I have all the time. And then there's that other factor of winning because it means you get perceived income.
Mhm. Now, there are situations where you've got these rogue judges that are taking a parent and giving them an earning capacity that they just don't have. And then, really coming after them for the child support and in fact jailing them if they can't pay it. And what that does to the children is so detrimental.
Oh, yes, especially if this is already a parent that they have gone, which I mean, it would be in this situation, right? Because typically the parent that's paying child support is the one with the less time. It's usually a
Mhm.
visitation schedule. So they've already experienced that loss.
Mhm.
So if you're going to then arrest them, that's going to then disrupt what visitation schedule they did have with their parent, and that's going to potentially hurt that relationship even more.
Right. Right. In fact, it can even cause so much resentment that it could turn into a physical altercation with that parent, finding out that the other parent has been sent to prison. And this is not helping the situation at all. I know a lot of parents say, well, just send them to jail if they're not paying their child support. But I don't think that's the answer. I don't know what you think the answer is.
I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. I mean, look at how we've dealt with rent during this crisis. Like, we're not sending people to jail for not paying their rent. We stopped kind of a lot of that practice of sending people to jail. Like, we kind of saw that as maybe not so great of a way to deal with debt. So, but that can also be because there there's a lot a very interesting pressure
Mhm,
towards, especially when it is the father, right? Because we can at least talk clearly that the numbers do show that this does statistically happen. And I don't want to make it about a gender, by the way,
mhm.
because it does happen to both. And I don't find it happening more or less to any gender, like acceptable by any means. But a lot of the times, there's this whole deadbeat dad narrative. So when they go and they look for child support, they will do all sorts of things to even try to make those numbers look bigger so that
Mhm,
they're paying more than they can actually reasonably pay. Like, some of these child support payments are put higher than a car payment that person
mhm,
may not have even been able to afford before.
mhm,
So it's like, are we actually doing the calculation for the child support properly? Or are we trying to inflate it so that it is acting more like that income mentality? And so that goes back to trying to find ways to cut away from this being an income mentality.
mhm. It seems like it's just not stopping. People are getting their jollies off of making money off of this, and I just thought, why don't we try people out at 50-50, and hopefully there's not a high conflict situation or personality disorder that will not work with the other parent, and just, get rid of the child support, and everyone pays their own fair share.
Exactly. And there could even be, I talk about income disparity just because of how it can be a big difference between the homes. But like, you could also easily argue and maybe give a path, like, say, if the parent who does have the higher paying job is also readily able to work towards, they provide clothes for the kids and they really help out in a way that affects more than just within their own home. Like, there's ways to move away from this dynamic of it
Mhm,
being an income source feeling. And even then, like, that puts a bit of resentment between two people.
mhm,
You know what I mean? Like, even we know, don't do business with family, right? Very
right,
common understanding in our culture that putting a money relationship between two humans makes that relationship inherently more stressful.
mhm,
So if we can find a way to move beyond it, if we can find a way where it's like, yeah, sure, income disparity, great, but maybe that other parent, may it be the dad who had actually elected to stay home and is not the type of person that has either an education or something to get them right into a job where they can make the same as their prior partner, that would at least allow like some time for them. Because if you're only having, and I don't even like to say the word having, because you're getting to raise children, you don't
mhm.
have to raise them in this situation, right? if,
Right,
if you're getting to raise your children every week, but then the other turn of that is that every other week you do get to kind of focus on yourself. So that's where you can invest that time and hopefully get yourself where you're making that better income for you.
mhm,
It shouldn't rely on the other parent, because if they lose their job or have to take something lower paying, then that's going to always control that anyway. So even just for your own personal stability, I don't understand the wanted reliance
Mm-hmm.
on getting that as a source of money.
Right. It should be an award, like you're awarded more child support. It just, I think, I don't understand why parents just can't work together. I mean, even without a mediator, I don't know if you've seen the film Erasing Family or not.
Not yet, no.
That's a good one to watch. But they talk about the Sweden model. You know, you just go in with your spouse, sit down at the table and just write up a schedule, write up an, you know, how maybe one parent could help the other parent if they're not making the money or if they need help, and just work together. And, and then they said, the kids kind of don't like bouncing back and forth to each house, but at least they get to see both parents.
And just because kids don't like their vegetables doesn't mean it's not good for them. There are several growing studies that show that even in high conflict situations, 50-50 can work really well for the kids. They had less negative effects on mental health. They had less, like, they did better in school,
Mhm.
So, and honestly, it would makes me wonder, in Sweden, there might be a cultural difference though, because I don't know about Sweden, but I know in America, we don't exactly practice healthy breaking up, like even when there are not children involved. So it's one of my weird side tangents of like, man, if I could just snap my fingers and change something about our culture, like let's normalize walking away from conversations where somebody's just spilling out the negative. And
Mhm.
by that, I mean, I was married once before,
Mhm.
and I actually lost a friendship because that friend could not fathom that I could still get along with my ex-husband.
Mhm.
And it was a lot of weirdness and awkwardness of like trying to get me to talk bad about him, and
Mhm.
trying to like get like, yeah, he's a bad person. I never should have been with him. And it's like, well, yeah, this situation actually wasn't. And bear in mind, we don't have any kids together. I don't have any biological children myself, just to go ahead and put that out there, because a lot of what I try to talk about with the Heroes Circle is the fact that I'm not trying to win custody. I'm not trying to change any child support situation in my own personal life.
Mhm.
But going back to kind of this idea that we demonize exes, and our friends even kind of encourage it, even when there's really no reason to.
Mhm.
So when there are kids involved, and we already have this kind of societal, cultural kind of appropriateness to making somebody hate their ex just because they broke up, I just can't help but feel like that translates into that bigger picture when you stick those humans into the court system of
Mhm.
then winning and losing, because then it's in court whether or not you won or lost that relationship and who the bad guy is, to put that in quotes, the bad guy.
Right, right. It seems like there's always a good guy and a bad guy or a target parent, which is very
Yes.
sad. And there's also things that play into this family court situation, like collusion. Like sometimes, the judge wants to do the opposing attorney a favor. These types of things play into this, and the case is already decided before the parent walks in there.
And that's another reason that why I feel the best role the court can play is to find ways to not be involved. And so if we can normalize things like this whole rebuttable presumption of 50-50, because if that means that those parents have to sit and come to an agreement, then doesn't that help take it away from the court? It just gives it one less moment of having to be in that arena.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly, exactly. Now, sometimes, well, I would have to say most of the time, when you're in family court and the judge orders visitation and the other parent just will say conceals the kiddos from the other parent when they come to pick them up, and the lights are on and no one's home. And, I I feel there should be fines for enforcing this contempt. However, there is no accountability in these courtrooms.
Right. And that's where I have heard recently of some, and I wanted to say they were a bill. So I am apologizing if I'm not using the proper legal lingo here. But essentially, what they're trying to do is get it passed in some areas where it would be a ticketable offense. So, because the awkward situation that we really put police officers in when we call them to these, hey, parent A is not giving parent B their kids. We need you to get here and escort this or whatever, right?
Hmm.
Is that the only choice that they would have, I guess, in a lot of those situations is to choose to arrest the parent. So
Hmm.
you're actively asking an officer to arrest a parent. Now, granted, yes, that parent is in the wrong, but
Hmm.
I'm still overall saying, what are we doing to our kids here?
Hmm.
Now, giving them a ticket is a little bit different because that can be no more traumatizing than mom had lead foot and got pulled over by a cop and just got this little ticket from the police. They give the ticket like, oh, child's not going. Here's your ticket for whatever financial range that is. And I can't help but agree that if you do that a few times, that parent is going to be a little bit more on board with making sure their child is ready to go. They are encouraging that that child is going to go. They're not, it takes away the incentive
Hmm.
because they can't have their cake and eat it too. You
Mm.
have to pick. You can either incur a fine and continue this campaign or continue supporting your child's, wishes to not go if you want to really believe those are their wishes. Um, or you can understand that this is what was decided,
Hmm.
that you signed this paperwork too, that you said that they will go on these dates, these times. And so part of your responsibility as the parent is making sure that that happens. And one of my humble opinions on it is that if you're a parent that honestly feels that your child's relationship with the other parent is not your problem, I kind of can't help feel that that might be part of the problem because I mean, even when you're living together, right? Like when you've got your happy family unit and you're together, you should definitely care if your child has a good relationship with one of the parents. That shouldn't stop just because of a separation or divorce.
Hmm. And most definitely. And another problem as we go through the list of problems, right?
Oh, and we're only scratching the surface, I'm sure.
Right, exactly. You the judge always seems to want to talk to the children sequestered. I'm sure other states do it differently. And, I don't know what you think, they go in there and they take your child in there along with the attorneys and a court reporter, and the judge is not asking the appropriate questions, in my opinion. Like, "Who drove you here? What were you told to tell me?" What do you think of those situations when, I hate to say that children are coached?
Yes. Um, and yeah, it's different state for state. There's some states where they have decided they will never take the child's opinion into consideration. There's some that do it earlier. My alienation story stems in Texas, so that's the one I'm a little bit more well versed in. Texas will allow a child to testify at 14.
Mhm,
And I used to be a strong proponent of interviewing children. I have since been humbled in that. And a lot of that was even my realization of my alienation when my big fight happened with my dad. That was spurred after kind of some months of some negative talk, from my mother into my own ear. And then it really feels like to me that it really ramped up because it was family knowledge that I was going to be talking to this judge,
mhm,
you know? So I just find it, I think horses, not zebras, that it can't be too much of a coincidence that the fight that happened, that, my mother was then able to be in my ear because essentially what happened is they went on vacation without me.
mhm,
And so with them being on vacation without me, that time was used to get me convinced that I never wanted to see him again. And that was, I even called it my big girl choice, that I didn't want to see him again. So I can't help that because that happened just so few months before that I
mhm,
was going to turn 14 and be able to testify. It's something that I had, openly said I wanted to do this. I wanted to go live with my dad, etc. I can't help but feel like that didn't factor somehow into that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you've got that part of it too, right? Is if parents are aware that kids can be interviewed, it gives that incentive to want to kind of coach that behind the scenes. Meanwhile, if they know it's not a possibility, then it kind of would take away even some of the temptation to do it. If
Mm-hmm.
you know it's not an option from the beginning. So that's one part of it. And then as far as like intentional or not, being accidentally coached by a bunch of adults that you don't know, because kids in that power dynamic, they just
Mm-hmm.
want to tell the adults what they want to hear. And that's mostly what they're trying to figure out, especially if they are dealing in a stressful situation, which is implied by them even being asked what their opinion is, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
a child isn't typically asked their opinion if it's going dandy, if it's going swell. So I would assume that there's already a lot of underlying stress, and that would be some of the reasons that I now see, like, maybe this isn't the greatest idea. Maybe if you are going to try to investigate how a relationship is affecting a child, it should be done by somebody who is very well trained in child psychology and very well trained in these specific situations. And that even comes back into play as to why it needs to be, it's so important to get parental alienation back to being recognized as child abuse, because
Mm-hmm.
this is again where we could see and catch some of those things early, some of these behaviors. So
Mm-hmm.
that way, if you've got a professional that's well versed and good at talking to kids, because, you know, a child psychologist talks to a child totally different than an older judge.
Mm-hmm.
They know how to be welcoming. They know how to like get them playing and get them talking. So I guess all of that was really to say that if we are going to try to take the kids, their experience and how they're doing emotionally even into consideration, that needs to be done in a very different way than bringing them in and putting them in such a high stress situation, which is interviewing with a bunch of strange adults.
Mm-hmm.
It's often once or twice, whereas with the counselor relationship, they would be building rapport first, right?
Mm-hmm.
These divorces don't happen overnight. There's time for somebody to do this if that's the course they want to take.
Mm-hmm. I was listening to Dr. Roseman talk. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's really excellent. He wrote the book Preserving Family Ties.
Mhm.
And I did a podcast with him, and he said, if you're going to have a family court judge, they've got to be in there for their whole career and not be moved around, to criminal court. Now, 4 months later, you're being moved over here. They have to be well-versed in this child abuse, this emotional child abuse, and be able to recognize it, to be able to recognize when a parent is lying. See, I think these judges are inexperienced in that and saying, oh, I can tell, I can't tell who's telling the truth,
Yes. And I think that's a lot of why some judges will try to give that little bit of a spiel, like I had mentioned, of, it's going to be best if you guys choose between you, because it really is kind of a weird position to put a judge in, especially because it's not being trained so specifically. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, sure, you can. There are judges who are in family court, and that is what they do. But to your point, there are some that aren't always in there or have jumped around. And so that's where you get a little bit more riskiness. But even then, because there's not really any like requirements to understand the full psychology of family in order to be a judge, or at least not to my awareness. I am not aware of any psychological training that family judges need to do. It's
Mhm.
different. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that's necessary. And those are the things I think are missing,
Mhm.
is that end of understanding, because that's where I think it either needs to be a line that's drawn or further training that's needed to
Mhm.
specialize as a judge in these cases. Because either it's a line that's drawn and we really have these professionals that will speak to that, just like in any other court case, right? You have
Mhm.
professionals, you have the people who evaluate like where the bullet went into the wall, all these other CSI fans out here, if
Mhm.
we have any. You got specialists. So either that needs to be that you're taking the testimony of a specialist who is trained in this and has interviewed and done all of their due diligence to present that end of the case to the judge,
Mhm.
or that judge needs to have special training in order to be a family court judge.
Now, I have heard that in some states there are there is training for these judges to recognize this child abuse of parental alienation. But hopefully, and the hope is with these new judges that are younger coming up, and they're more receptive to this parental alienation, emotional child abuse, that maybe they can help end the stupidity of high conflict litigation.
Yes, I am a big fan of mediation over litigation. Like,
Hmm.
I understand if you had a hard separation, right? Because let's be
Hmm.
real, relationships don't end all the time just because you wake up and go, you know what, I don't feel like I'm growing as well as a person anymore. It's sometimes it's high conflict. And that's where I really think mediation is a really awesome tool that I really wish more parents used, because even in some of the experiences that I'm aware of friends going through things is, the court will sometimes require a mediation, but they'll
Hmm.
only require one. So it becomes a check in the box step of, oh, okay, I have to do this in order to go to the thing and fight.
Hmm.
And it's not exactly incentivizing it is the tool that it could be used for. It's just kind of turned into a check in the box sometimes. And that's where I'd love to see more of that.
Right. And during the mediation, I wish they would make parents aware of how much money they're really going to spend in family court, and
Hmm.
how it's going to be dragged out with these attorneys pulling continuances every so often and dragging a case out. It's just very annoying.
Oh yeah, and attorneys, you've got, just like with doctors or any other professional, really, I guess, you've got the good ones that are in there
Mm.
for the good reasons, and then you've got the ones that realize that they don't profit if mediation
Right.
becomes the standard for resolving these. Some of these people look at it, and I understand they invested money, they invested time, they got their degree. They don't want to have to struggle for clients. And as much as I do understand investing and wanting to be able to pursue, what you had intended as your profession, I don't think it should be paid for by the mental problems and mental illnesses of children who
Mhm.
grow up and have to deal with the long-term issues that are
Mhm.
caused by this.
I totally agree, because these parents don't understand that these kids are developing stomach ulcers, they're getting migraines. There's just, if parents would just understand and tell their attorneys, look, I don't want to go to family court. I need to sit down and mediate and get this over with. And these attorneys have to understand that, okay, we've got to put the kid first.
Exactly. And I think it's funny, there are still some areas that will require counseling for getting into your marriage. But I sometimes play with this world that maybe requires counseling, like after you're ending a marriage where kids are involved.
Hmm.
That way it's more than just like a boot camp mentioning. Again, you do have some states and some areas that are really trying.
Hmm.
They'll have a class that might be a day or two, right? And it'll tell you, it's like, oh, this would be really great for your kids. But again, when it turns into a check in the box, it turns into your lawyer giving you a list of things like, well, you have to do this, and then you have to do this, and then we'll have a court date after that,
Hmm.
because that's what you're being driven towards doing.
Hmm. Definitely. Yeah, it's very difficult. There's like no real clear-cut answer to it, and we're trying to find ways to alleviate this problem.
Exactly. The first step to solving a problem, though, is addressing it. And that's why this needs to be talked about. 3.9 million children are affected by overt or covert alienation. Like, that is a stumbling amount. And we also look at it when you look at other things that are kind of coming to our awareness is, there is some focus in public schools where they're realizing that kids are struggling with kind of mental health stuff. They're getting anxiety like in middle school.
Right.
And I can't help but personally wonder if this doesn't feed into a lot of that number too. So let's do this for all of the kids. If we
Mhm.
can look at this and see where, like, how much of that is being contributed to because that child was on a strict visitation schedule with one of their parents that that child does not want.
Mhm.
Like they want more in that sense. Like they don't want the strict visitation.
Mhm. Mhm. Some kids are happy with bouncing back and forth, like 5 days on, 5 days off. And, and if they forget their cell phone charger, well, then we'll just drive over and get it. It's like not a big deal.
Oh, exactly. And it's like, and I go back to like even in high conflict situation, there is so much like technology and advancements out there. I love that somebody made a third party app for communication. Like I think that is absolutely wonderful. I won't name drop. There's some out there. If you look, there are co-parenting apps. And it's great because personally I could see, where that would benefit both parents. Like you're not having to give information to this person that you don't want to talk to. You're just uploading it to the file where you keep all of your child's information. And what's nice is that other parent gets to still feel very included and very on the nose as far as, hey, like they've got a doctor's appointment this week. They're signing up for this thing and here's some school stuff that's going on. Because it can be calendaring, it can be doctor's appointments, it can be medical records. These things are being built to carry more. And even so, some of them have add-ons to help proofread your message. Like, hey, this feels a little passive aggressive. Can you read it again? Like I've even heard of sometimes that being in parenting agreements now.
Mhm.
And I would be a big fan of seeing that used more, where a judge, when they do have to make a decision, at least maybe that judge could also add in there like, hey, this is high conflict. So I'm going to say that you guys should use this tool
Mhm.
for all of your communication. Please do not email each other. Please do not text each other. All communication here. So there are a lot of ways to mitigate this that I could see, some of these more creative parenting plans are updated, right? Like a lot of parenting plans are still written like the ones from in the 90s when I was a kid.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, we do have good technology. I mean, granted, there are some that are more updated, like you can't block text messaging and things like that. But where is all the using some of these nice tools that can help that relationship be less strained so that the child can enjoy their relationship with both parents a little bit easier?
Mhm. I agree. These kids have to have happy childhoods because once they get out in the working world, you know how fun that is. Okay.
Yes. Yes. And it's like we don't need the days anymore of any parent ever finding it excusable. Here, go give this bill to your other parent.
Mhm.
Here, just go hand this to them. Like that doesn't need to happen. There's really no reason. There's email, even if you don't want to walk up to them and hand it to them.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's really my personal focus is seeing a world where we're not continually adding to this millions of number of children affected by this. It's
Mhm.
just not necessary. There's 35 plus years of literature and studies. Like the information is out there, which tells me that this is an awareness and an education thing at this point. And then of course, something that we want to do at the Heroes Circle is actually figure out what we need to do so that we can really fight for some of this change to
Mhm.
happen.
Mhm.
One thing I would love to see that I mentioned a little bit ago, I want parental alienation to be back to being recognized as abusive. Because you go back to, you're talking about emotional abuse here, and that's still a relatively new thing to be
Mhm.
recognized, that you can emotionally abuse your child, right? Because
Right.
before it was just discipline. And the segue I like to go into with that is like, well, I vividly remember spanking. And I remember spanking being totally fine, totally normal part of childhood. And again,
Mhm.
I'm in
Mhm.
Texas, so we were
Yeah.
behind everybody. They hang on to things about 20 years longer than everybody else. Is
Right.
my running joke. But I do remember when it was okay to be spanked at school. And then I
Mhm.
do remember like how much, some of the tried to like, oh, well, if you come and sign this waiver, we can still spank your kids. You know what I mean? And nowadays
Mhm.
that just seems so crazy that
Mhm.
that anybody at the school would spank a child,
Mhm.
right? So, and now with like more education and more awareness, we have less parents that even practice spanking.
Mhm.
So, and it being recognized that especially some of the ways that used to be practiced was abusive. So that's where I get to, just like we had to break through with spanking,
Mhm.
we need to break through more with emotional abuse with kids and how that is totally a thing you can be doing. We need to break through more on the awareness that gutting the relationship with the other parent is not going to improve your relationship with your child. It's only going to increase that child's likelihood of kind of falling into some other unfortunate demographics.
Mhm. Yes. It's something, that hopefully this will happen. I don't know. Do you think it will happen like within 10 to 25 years? How long do you think? What's your guesstimation?
Oh gosh, let me get in there first. I got to start trying to figure out how to make these big changes, because that was the interesting discovery. Really, was when I started, because from the fathers, right, it seemed almost kind of natural for me to discover some of the support groups specific to parental alienation. And one of the early struggles I had was realizing that there was nothing out there for me. There
Mm,
was no support group for adult children. There were a lot of people speaking out. I found a lot of Instagram accounts and, that are talking about the situation, but I couldn't find a community. So I guess that's what's kind of nice to kind of slide in here is with the Hero Circle. We have started that community. There are more of us.
mhm,
And I think the more of us that we get to speak out, to talk about our experience and how it affected us, the better. And I think that's going to be a lot of gathering stories from our fellow participants with the Heroes Circle to contribute to that book. I'm extremely excited about that. I'm not happy that it happened. I'm
right,
more excited,
right.
like, hey, let's get a really awesome team of people together and put these stories that we're comfortable with sharing and get awareness behind this. Because if we could just break through,
Mhm,
maybe it won't be as hard of a fight to get PA back to being recognized in the DSM and by WHO and all of the places that it got stripped away from.
mhm,
And maybe we can normalize things like 50-50 parenting so that people with alienating attitudes and behaviors stick out like even more of a sore thumb.
mhm,
Because again, you'll have that quick indicator of, why are you fighting this?
mhm.
Just I want to see so much change. I wish I had a good timeline answer though, because who really knows? We're still. I'm glad that we've got the internet and the ability to campaign in different ways and kind of get the knowledge out there, get the awareness out there. I know I do every now and then through my Instagram. I'll put something that's hashtag with parental alienation, and there is an awareness to it because those
Mhm,
are rapidly responded to.
mhm,
And we've got that out there. We've also got where we can do the ability to go and meet some of these legislatures and lawmakers and interview with people, because as crazy as the pandemic has been, it's
mhm,
totally opened people's eyes to being able to have virtual conversations.
mhm,
So now we might even see where we're able to interview more and more and more. I'm no longer going to be well, I mean, me personally, but people who advocate are no longer really restricted to just within their state. They can reach out wherever they want now. And I would love to see that continue on. As crazy as this pandemic has been, if we can
mhm.
keep that, and maybe curbside pickup. Curbside pickup is also a great invent of this time, but maybe still keep these virtual meetings where we can reach out in these ways and get in touch with legislation and lawmakers and people that are the movers and shakers. So people who care about this movement in Oregon can go have their voice heard also with California people,
Mhm.
because we need to change it everywhere. I don't think a child in any state should have to deal with this. And that goes back to that overall dream of just seeing the United States really embrace this concept that kids need both.
Mhm. Yes, definitely. How many stories are going to be in this book?
That is to be determined,
Mhm,
because if there are a lot of stories, we are talking about potentially doing a part two.
mhm,
So as we gather them, because with alongside with Victim to Hero, we are doing some of the interviews.
mhm,
So it's going to be a collection of taking them either by interview, or we're also talking about possibly making a form submission, because we don't want people to feel like they can't share their story just because they can't speak about it. A lot of people are more comfortable writing about it. There's a lot to be said about writing therapy, right?
right.
So I'm hoping that we can even spur more that way. I would love to see one book. If there's a second book, if there's a third book, 3.9 million. I want to keep bringing up that number. That's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So if they can find a venue and a way that they're open to communicating their story, we want them to be in the book, which is really something that hopefully will make this easier for people.
Mm-hmm.
Because, hey, there's a lot of us that still have a relationship, in a way with that alienating parent. So by asking you to go public about it, it can cause a lot of other family issues that maybe you're just kind of waiting to let those things kind of subside and go. And we don't want to put people in that position. And, we're excited about getting the book out because that is going to provide like some funding for other programs. We want to figure out what we can do. And a lot of that is going to help spur figuring out what actions we can take to make real changes. And fortunately, I've been able to kind of get in touch with other people that have been in this game for a while. So I've got a big learning curve, but I'm ready to take it on because I am on fire and I'm ready to stop the bleeding. Because that's my big thing. Can we stop the bleeding? Like, can we just stop making more? And then maybe we can work on getting the message out there so people who were affected by this can get real and proper help. Because that's another very important piece, like not only to make it stop happening, but also for proper treatment for all of the people who are negatively affected by parental alienation really stems on getting it recognized in the diagnostic and statistical manual that our psychologists and psychiatrists use. So it's such a linchpin to fixing so many things about this. It'll help stop it. It'll help the adult children like myself get help. It'll help the alienated parents get proper help. So I'm game for getting this recognized again.
How about sending this book when you have it published to law schools?
Ooh, I don't know if that's something that we've talked openly about, but that would be a very interesting way to do it. I know we have talked about, and we're in the beginning stages of talking about it, but we're starting to brainstorm kind of ideas on, okay, where do we get educational about this? Where do we get education programs that are even appropriate possibly at the child level, because you can teach concepts about not being bullied. And really, when you think about some of these alienating behaviors and attitudes, it's kind of almost parallel to some bullying behaviors that you would see in other kids or even other adults, because kids can be bullied by adults in general. So it's really just finding a way that we can approach that topic to kids too, because we want kids to be able to speak, right? We do. We want them to speak when they're being abused, but if they don't notice, like, what's happening is abuse, they're not going to be able to speak about it. I wasn't able to speak about my abuses, and that's because I didn't have an open place to do it. So when we educate and we start conversations and talking about it, that's where kids learn what is taboo to talk about, what is okay to talk about.
Now, if anyone has any questions, how can they contact you? Do you have a lot of people contacting you?
Oh, well, yes and no. I do end up in some very interesting conversations because I do moderate the Heroes Circle support group, which is through Facebook right now. I don't know if we're going to move that platform eventually, but right now we found Facebook to be a good place for it. But all of that, you can actually be put in touch with the Heroes Circle and with that support group. There's links if you go to theheroescircle.com. I believe you mentioned that you might be putting in links in a bio or somewhere. And I do have a lot of conversations. It's really kind of interesting because sometimes we get an adult who's just a alienated parent that tries to join, and really I just try to connect them with other people, but it's a lot of open conversation, and I let them know, like, hey, I'm actually okay with talking about my story. So if there's anything you do want to ask, because that's really what we're trying to keep safe in that community, is we want that to be a place not where other survivors really can be grilled with questions by a parent who's in this state of panic because they're trying to get their own child back, right? And there are places that I can connect them to, and some of those conversations have just been so beautiful. And then I also have an Instagram account, so if anybody did want to just talk to me, I am a very open person. I post a lot about my mental healing journey, my mental hygiene, and stuff like that. So it's led to a lot of interesting conversations. But that is at There Is Life After Trauma. So if for some reason reaching out officially through the Heroes Circle is a little much, but you'd still like to be in touch and maybe have a chat, I totally check those messages. And I've had a lot of very interesting conversations on there as well.
Okay, do you have any advice for these parents that are going through, we're going to be going through Mother's Day and Father's Day? Do you have
Oh,
anything you'd like to add? And that's my last question, I promise.
oh no, you're fine. I could talk to you for a while. This has been totally pleasant. Really, my number one piece of advice for anybody out there, not just the parents, but there are adult children who grieve an alienated mother who has died or anything like that. Like they never got to, reconcile with that. And so there's mourning on both sides out there. Just to throw that out for whatever reason, that just felt like I should share it.
Mhm,
But I guess so. My number one piece of advice to anybody who's feeling heartbreak for really any reason over Mother's Day is try to prioritize your mental hygiene and your self-care on those days.
mhm,
There is a lot of interesting theory to the idea of being addicted to like a negative emotion. So for
mhm,
example, if the last handful of Mother's Days have been horrible for you, either because you're thinking about the child that you're mourning because they've been separated from you, or if you're an adult who was separated from your mother and you're mourning that you missed that chance to be able to, or maybe it's just for whatever reason you're not able to get back in touch with that mother figure, you know, take care of yourself. Don't be too hard on yourself. Don't make yourself go out and do anything. And yeah, I mean, it's really those days, getting through those days that
mhm,
are gonna pack you with an emotional punch is really about the self-care. I know how like hokey that probably sounds,
mhm,
but if you, especially if you don't have access to counseling or a therapist, because if you do have access to counseling and a therapist, maybe give them a heads up that this
mhm.
is going to be a hard day for you, and then you can talk about that with them as well.
Definitely. Well, I'm so glad to have you on, and I'd like to have you come back on again.
Well, I would be open to, especially depending on what you wanted to cover, I'd be happy to.
Right, and if anything comes up, like when your book is published or, if something new has popped up, let me know, and I'll have you come back on.
Well, I'll be happy to return for sure.
Well, thank you, Tracy. Slam the Gavel is a podcast to help the public understand what really goes on in the family courtrooms that in turn perpetuate parental alienation. I'm your host, Marianne Petrie, author of Dismantling Family Court Corruption, Why Taking the Kids Was Not Enough, and Cry Out for Justice, Poems of Truth. Please join us again in the future with Tracy and other guests in the future. Thank you so much, Tracy.
Again, thank you for having me on.